Well, we said a few times now together that the Lord's Prayer is searching and transforming. And that is definitely true as we continue to the next line. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. To help us think about it, I want to take us to Psalm 51 in the Old Testament, where King David writes a psalm of confession. This psalm was written after a very sorry tale in David's life. He had had an affair with Bathsheba. Her husband was a military officer, and she became pregnant. They tried to cover it up once by enticing the husband to come back and lay with his wife, which failed. And then they tried again, where David rearranged the whole military strategy of Israel twice to try and have the man killed, which also failed. It brought shame and dishonour and defeat to God's people, although David did then think he'd gotten away with it. But he hadn't. He was confronted by Nathan the prophet, who came and told him a story. He said that there was once a rich man who had many sheep and a poor man who just had one little lamb. The rich man decided to take and eat the poor man's little lamb. Well, David was incensed. He thought he might be talking about one of his subjects, and he demanded that this man be brought to justice. Nathan then says, "You are the man." David is convicted of his sin. He recognises what he has done, and he turns to God for mercy. And he finds it. And it's that experience that this psalm is written out of. Two things from this psalm. The first is David's sinfulness, and the second is God's overwhelming forgiveness. Well, David's sinfulness is obvious, isn't it, from the story? But in the psalm it is interesting how he talks about it. Let me quote you some verses. "For I know my transgressions, and my sin is always before me. Against you only have I sinned, and done what is evil in your sight, so that you are proved right when you speak, and justified when you judge. Surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me." Do you notice how David considers the root of his sin? And amazingly, he says, "Against you only have I sinned." You see, David really has sinned against a lot of people. Against his own wife, against Bathsheba, against the nation, and of course ultimately God. But as he traces the root of this sin, he says that the most important thing, the most wicked thing of all that he has done, is sin before God. David doesn't excuse his sin. He doesn't try and blame it on his circumstances. He doesn't try and say it's about his upbringing. He honestly assesses it and takes it to its root. He's honest, in a way that we are very rarely honest. But this is key. This is important to him recognising his need for God. We all too have a great need for God. We are all sinful, like David says, to our very core, and sinful from birth. Let me show you that, in part by talking about another David. Maybe you know that one of the most respected actors in Britain is David Tennant, who's played all kinds of different roles, including Doctor Who and so on. And when you look at David Tennant, whenever you see him in anything, you just think, that is amazing how he can do that. He has such capability. Whether it's a funny role, or a sad role, or a dramatic role, he seems to pull it off. Well, David, our David, the David who wrote the psalm, is saying we're like that on the inside, but not positively. That the seeds of all sin lie in the root of our darkened hearts. Talking about David Tennant, one of his most famous roles was as a detective in Broadchurch, where he was invited into a village to investigate a murder. The drama is great and gripping because anyone can do it. It might have been the nosy neighbour, or the old lonely man, or the vicar, or the hotel owner. And you follow David Tennant as he tries to figure out what happened. The local villagers are stunned by this, of course, because they know all of these people. They can't imagine someone among them would do such an evil thing. And yet in the middle of the drama, David Tennant says this: anyone is capable of murder, given the right circumstances. And according to what our David, King David, is saying here, the same is true of all of us, not necessarily of murder, but of any sin. The seeds of all sin lie in the darkness of our hearts. With David, we must recognise this. However, that's not all we see in these opening verses. We also see God's overwhelming forgiveness. In verses 1 and 2, we see David seeking mercy. And here's what he says: have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash away all my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. One author, Derek Kidner, when writing about this psalm, says this: for all his unworthiness, he, David, knows he belongs. You wonder why David goes to God. He's obviously sinned, hasn't he? You would expect that really it's over for him. That was true of his predecessor Paul. And yet David turns to the Lord. For all his unworthiness, he knows he belongs. And he finds in God this overwhelming, life-changing experience of forgiveness. How does that happen? Well, later on, Nathan and the prophet and he are talking. The son who is the product of this affair has died. David is convinced that it is his sin that has led this to happen. And Nathan talks to him about all many matter of things. But what he does say is that the Lord has taken away your sin. So in amongst this confusing situation of losing a son, David is given this assurance that the Lord has forgiven him. And it's this that then sparks the writing of this psalm, I think. Well, we as Christians can have the same assurance that the Lord has taken away our sin. We have it because the Lord God sent his Son to die for us on the cross, the innocent one to stand in our place, to pay our debt and seal our pardon. In him we are forgiven. In him we can have this same overwhelming experience of God's grace. And it's this that changes us. It changes us when we first become Christians, but it also changes us day by day. You see, we always go back to Jesus, we always go back to the cross to see that our pardon is set. And in that we are changed more and more, because the more we go on in the Christian life, the more we recognise how sinful we are. And the more we see God's goodness, we recognise how bad this is. And yet we also see how good a thing it is that God is so gracious and merciful and removes our sin. Jesus, when talking about the Lord's Prayer here, ties together two things. He ties together our experience of forgiveness and our treatment of others. Now, he's not doing it in some forensic way where he's saying that we are forgiven as and when we decide to forgive other people around us. But he's saying that our experience feels often like this. The more we know God's mercy in our lives, the more we recognise how much we've needed forgiven, the more we will be changed, and the more we will forgive others. If you want to think about that more, please look at Luke chapter 7, verses 35 to 50. But in the meantime, take some time now to think about what we've seen from Psalm 51 and help it to help you pray. Firstly, in verses 3 to 5, David avoids shifting the blame for his sin and considers it honestly, tracing it to its roots. Is that how you consider your sin? Why or why not? In bringing his sin to light before God, David has an experience of overwhelming forgiveness. Have you ever had this? For all his sinfulness, he knows he belongs. How is it that we can know the same thing?